The harsh winter of 1923 had settled over the mountains of West Virginia like a suffocating blanket, bringing with it the final notice that would forever change Eleanor Ruth Hawthorne's life. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets against the windows of the two-story farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of her family, while inside, the 34-year-old widow sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers that spelled out her financial ruin in stark black ink. The coal mining accident that had claimed her husband Samuel just 18 months earlier had not only shattered her heart, but destroyed any hope of maintaining the property that represented everything her family had built since arriving from Ireland in 1847. Before we continue with Eleanor's remarkable journey, tell us where you're watching from today. And if this story of hidden treasure and unexpected fortune captivates you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have another incredible tale of ordinary people discovering extraordinary secrets that changed their lives forever. Eleanor had never imagined she would face such devastating circumstances when she married Samuel Hawthorne at the age of 19 in the small mountain community of Cedar Ridge. Born Eleanor Ruth O'Malley, to parents who had worked the same coal seams that would eventually claim her husband's life, she had grown up understanding the harsh realities of Appalachian existence, where men disappeared into the earth each morning with no guarantee they would return to see another sunset. Her childhood had been marked by the constant anxiety that shadowed mining families, the knowledge that prosperity and tragedy lived as neighbors in communities where black lung disease and cave-ins claimed more lives than old age ever would. Samuel had been different from the other young men who courted her during those years when the Great War was transforming America and creating opportunities for those bold enough to seize them, where others saw only the continuation of their fathers. Dangerous work in the mines, Samuel possessed vision that extended beyond the mountain ridges that defined their world. He had invested his mining wages in purchasing additional land surrounding the original Hawthorne homestead, believing that diversification into farming and timber could provide security that underground work could never guarantee. His death in the spring of 1922 had occurred not through the dramatic explosion or cave-in that haunted the nightmares of every mining wife, but through the slow suffocation of rock dust that had accumulated in his lungs over 15 years of faithful service. To the Consolidated Coal Company, Eleanor had watched helplessly as the man who had promised her a future above ground gradually lost his ability to breathe, his strong hands growing weak as his body fought a battle it could never win against the microscopic particles that had invaded his chest with each shift he had worked to build their dreams. The medical bills from his final months, combined with the loss of his income and the debts he had accumulated purchasing additional property during more optimistic times, had created a financial crisis that Eleanor's modest skills as a seamstress and occasional teacher could never address. The bank that held the mortgage on their expanded holdings had shown initial patience, recognizing her as a member of a respected local family whose word had always been their bond. However, as months passed without meaningful progress toward debt reduction, sympathy had gradually given way to business necessity that threatened to strip away everything Samuel had worked to achieve. Cedar Ridge itself reflected the broader economic struggles that were reshaping Appalachian communities during the early 1920s. The post-war recession had reduced demand for coal, while increased mechanization eliminated many of the jobs that had sustained families for generations. Young people were leaving for opportunities in distant cities, hollowing out communities that had once thrived on the dangerous but steady work that the mountains provided. Those who remained found themselves caught between a dying way of life and an uncertain future that offered few alternatives for people whose skills had been honed in environments that the modern world was rapidly abandoning. Eleanor's situation was complicated by social expectations that limited women's options. During an era when independence remained more theoretical than practical for those without substantial family support or inherited wealth. Her parents had died in the influenza epidemic of 1918, taking with them not only emotional support but also the additional income that might have helped bridge the gap between Samuel's death and her establishment of sustainable self-sufficiency. Her only sibling, a brother named Patrick, had departed for steelwork in Pittsburgh before Samuel's illness, and communication with him had become sporadic as he struggled to establish his own foothold in an industrial economy that offered opportunity and exploitation in equal measure. The Hawthorne property itself represented both her greatest asset and her most overwhelming burden. The original homestead, built by Samuel's grandfather in 1875, occupied a strategic position in the valley where Copper Creek met the Elk River, providing access to both water and transportation that had made it valuable despite the region's economic challenges. The house, constructed from local timber and fieldstone, had been expanded over the years to accommodate Samuel's vision of prosperity, with additional rooms, a modern kitchen, and even indoor plumbing that made it one of the most comfortable residences in the area. Behind the main house stood a collection of outbuildings that told the story of the family's diverse economic activities. The barn could shelter livestock and store equipment, while a series of smaller structures housed everything from Samuel's woodworking tools to Eleanor's extensive garden supplies. A smokehouse, root cellar, and spring house provided food preservation, capabilities that had helped the family maintain self-sufficiency even during the most difficult economic periods. Most significantly, the property included nearly 400 acres of mixed farmland and timber that could theoretically provide sustainable income for someone with the knowledge and resources to manage such an operation effectively. However, Eleanor's practical experience with the property's commercial potential remained limited by the gender roles that had shaped her education and expectations. While she possessed extensive knowledge of domestic activities like gardening, food preservation, and household management, Samuel had handled all aspects of timber sales, livestock trading, and other business activities that required negotiation with outside parties. Her attempts to continue these operations after his death had met with mixed success, partly due to her inexperience, but also because local businessmen were reluctant to deal seriously with a woman whose husband was no longer available to guarantee any agreements they might reach. The financial pressures that had been building throughout 1923 reached a crisis point when the Consolidated Coal Company announced permanent closure of the mine where Samuel had worked, eliminating any possibility that Eleanor might find employment that could generate sufficient income to maintain her property payments. The company's decision reflected broader changes in the coal industry as mining operations consolidated into larger, more efficient facilities that could compete with petroleum products that were transforming American energy consumption patterns. Local economic conditions deteriorated rapidly following the mine closure as supporting businesses lost their customer base and families departed for opportunities elsewhere. The general store, where Eleanor had occasionally sold her sewing and baked goods, reduced its inventory and operating hours, while the railroad depot that had provided connection to outside markets began handling significantly less freight as the region's economic activity declined. Even the church that had served as the community's social center struggled to maintain its operations as tithing decreased and families relocated to areas with better employment prospects. Eleanor's efforts to generate income through various domestic activities had proven insufficient to address her mounting debts. Her sewing skills, while excellent, could not compete with mass-produced clothing that was becoming available through mail-order catalogs and regional stores. Her knowledge of traditional Appalachian crafts like quilting and weaving attracted some interest from tourists and collectors, but the market remained too small and unpredictable to provide reliable income. Even her occasional work as a substitute teacher in the local school system ended when budget constraints forced the elimination of positions that were not considered absolutely essential. The legal notice that had arrived with the morning mail on that snowy December day represented the final step in a process she had been dreading for months. The Farmers and Merchants Bank of Cedar Ridge, which held the mortgage on her property, had exhausted its patience with partial payments and promises of future improvement. The foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days, unless she could provide full payment of the outstanding balance, a sum that exceeded $3,000 and represented more money than she could reasonably expect to accumulate through any legitimate means available to her. The banker, Harrison Whitfield, had been apologetic but firm during their final meeting the previous week. As a longtime family friend who had attended Samuel's funeral and expressed genuine sympathy for Eleanor's situation, he had extended every courtesy possible within the constraints of business necessity and fiduciary responsibility to his depositors. However, the bank's own survival during challenging economic times required that non-performing loans be resolved through whatever means were available, including foreclosure proceedings that no one desired, but that circumstances made unavoidable. Eleanor had explored every possible alternative during the months leading up to this final crisis. Relatives who might have provided financial assistance were facing their own economic challenges or were too distant to fully understand her situation. Local businesses that might have offered employment were reducing their workforce rather than expanding it. Even the possibility of selling portions of her property to raise funds had proven impossible because potential buyers were scarce and those who expressed interest offered prices far below what the land was worth during better economic times. The thought of losing the home where she had expected to spend her entire life created emotional pain that rivaled the grief she had experienced following Samuel's death. Every room contained memories of their 15 years of marriage, from the parlor where they had entertained friends during happier times to the bedroom where she had nursed him through his final illness. The kitchen where she now sat had been the scene of countless family meals, holiday celebrations, and quiet conversations about their hopes for the future that would now never be realized. Beyond the personal attachment, losing the property would eliminate any possibility of economic recovery that might have been achieved through patience and gradual improvement in regional conditions. The Hawthorne land represented not only her current shelter, but also her only substantial asset and her best hope for eventual self-sufficiency. Once the foreclosure was completed, she would be reduced to the status of a dependent relative, forced to rely on the charity of others who were facing their own economic struggles. The winter weather that was making her final days on the property even more difficult also served as a harsh reminder of the practical challenges that lay ahead. The house's heating system, which Samuel had maintained through his knowledge of the coal stove and fireplace systems, required constant attention that Eleanor was still learning to manage effectively. The pipes that brought water from the spring occasionally froze despite her efforts to keep them warm, while the animals that remained required daily care regardless of weather conditions or her emotional state. Eleanor rose from the kitchen table, where the foreclosure papers lay scattered like fallen leaves, and moved to the window that looked out across the valley Samuel had loved. The snow continued falling, adding to accumulations that would make travel difficult and further isolate her from whatever help might be available in town. The bare trees that lined Copper Creek stood like silent witnesses to the end of an era, their branches heavy with ice that caught what little light penetrated the overcast sky. As she stood there contemplating the ruin of everything she had hoped to preserve, Eleanor felt the weight of decisions that would determine whether she could find some way to salvage her situation, or whether she would be forced to surrender everything that connected her to the life she had built with Samuel. The next 30 days would test every resource of courage, creativity, and determination she possessed, while the house around her kept its secrets, waiting for the moment when desperation would drive her to discover possibilities that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly half a century. Eleanor's daily routine had evolved into a carefully orchestrated survival strategy that began each morning before dawn, when the December air held a bitter edge that seemed to penetrate even the thickest woolen clothing she had inherited from her grandmother's generation. The coal stove that dominated her kitchen required constant feeding throughout the night to prevent the house from becoming uninhabitable, and her first task each day involved coaxing life back into embers that had dwindled to barely glowing remnants during the dark hours. The ritual of rebuilding the fire had become a meditation on persistence, each carefully placed piece of coal representing another day she could postpone the inevitable reckoning that waited at the end of January. Her fingers, once soft from the relative comfort of her married life, had developed calluses from splitting kindling and carrying coal buckets that Samuel had once handled without apparent effort. The transformation of her hands served as a daily reminder of how completely her circumstances had changed, from the protected wife of a successful man to a woman whose survival depended entirely on her own physical capabilities and mental resourcefulness. The wedding ring that had symbolized security and partnership now felt loose on fingers that had grown thin from worry, and the irregular meals that had become necessary as her resources dwindled. The house itself demanded constant attention that revealed both her growing competence and the limits of her mechanical knowledge. Water pipes that ran along the exterior walls required daily monitoring to prevent freezing, a process that involved checking temperatures in the basement and adjusting the small fires she maintained in strategic locations throughout the lower level. The roof had developed several leaks during autumn storms that Samuel would have repaired immediately, but Eleanor's attempts at patching had proven only temporarily effective, requiring her to position buckets and pans throughout the house to catch drips that created a constant percussion soundtrack to her daily activities. Her efforts to maintain the property's income-generating potential had met with mixed success that highlighted both her determination and her inexperience with business operations that Samuel had managed with apparent ease. The small herd of dairy cattle that had provided supplemental income during better times now represented more burden than benefit, as the cost of feed exceeded the value of milk she could sell in a market where demand had declined along with the local population. Yet she persisted in caring for the animals, partly from compassion, but also from stubborn refusal to surrender any asset that might eventually contribute to her financial recovery. The chickens that pecked around the farmyard, in defiance of winter weather, provided both eggs for her own consumption and occasional surplus that could be bartered for other necessities in town. Eleanor had discovered an unexpected talent for managing poultry, finding that her patient nature and attention to detail suited the careful observation required to maintain healthy flocks during challenging conditions. The birds seemed to respond to her gentle handling, producing eggs more consistently than they had during the final months of Samuel's illness, when his declining health had prevented him from providing the consistent care they required. Her kitchen garden, which had been primarily decorative during her married years, had evolved into a serious food production operation that supplied most of her vegetables and herbs. The root cellar beneath the house contained carefully preserved remnants of her autumn harvest, organized with the precision of someone who understood that each jar of green beans or bushel of potatoes represented security against hunger during the months when nothing grew. She had taught herself canning techniques that her mother had known but never passed on, learning through trial and error, supplemented by advice from neighboring women who recognized her genuine need for practical knowledge. The sewing skills that had once been merely a pleasant hobby had become her primary source of cash income, though the amounts generated barely covered her most essential expenses. Eleanor had established relationships with several families in Cedar Ridge who required alterations, repairs, and occasional new garments that their own domestic skills couldn't provide. Her reputation for excellent workmanship had spread through word-of-mouth networks that connected the scattered households throughout the valley, creating steady demand for her services even as the overall economy continued deteriorating. Working. By lamplight during the long winter evenings, Eleanor transformed fabric scraps and worn clothing into items that could command modest prices from customers who appreciated quality craftsmanship during times when money remained scarce. Her specialty had become children's clothing, where her attention to detail and understanding of growing bodies created garments that could withstand active use while providing room for expansion. Mothers throughout the region had learned to trust her judgment about sizing and durability, creating customer loyalty that provided some stability in an otherwise unpredictable economic environment. The isolation that characterized her current existence differed dramatically from the social connections that had enriched her married life. During Samuel's lifetime, their home had served as an informal gathering place for neighbors who stopped by to discuss farming techniques, share news, or simply enjoy the companionship that made mountain living bearable during difficult periods. Eleanor's natural hospitality and Samuel's knowledge of regional affairs had made their kitchen table a center for community discussions that helped everyone stay informed about developments that might affect their mutual welfare. Now, visitors had become rare as word of her financial difficulties spread throughout the community, creating awkwardness that discouraged casual social interaction. Some neighbors avoided contact from embarrassment about their inability to provide meaningful assistance, while others seemed to fear that association with someone facing foreclosure might somehow contaminate their own precarious stability. The resulting loneliness compounded the stress of her practical challenges, leaving her without the emotional support that community connections had previously provided during times of crisis. Her relationship with Cedar Ridge's business community had evolved from the comfortable familiarity of a valued customer to the strained politeness reserved for someone whose creditworthiness had become questionable. Merchants who had once extended credit without hesitation now required immediate payment, while service providers like the blacksmith and the miller had begun requesting compensation in advance, rather than relying on monthly settlements that had characterized her previous interactions. These changes, while understandable from business perspectives, created additional complications for someone whose cash flow remained unpredictable and whose need for services continued regardless of her ability to pay promptly. The weekly trips to town that had once provided pleasant breaks from farm routine had become exercises in careful calculation and strategic planning. Eleanor would walk the 2 miles each way to avoid the expense of maintaining a horse, carrying empty baskets that she hoped to fill with essential supplies purchased with whatever money her recent work had generated. The journey provided opportunities to gauge community sentiment about her situation while marketing her services to potential customers who might not have heard about her availability for sewing projects. These expeditions revealed the complex social dynamics that governed small mountain communities during economic crisis. Some residents expressed genuine sympathy and offered whatever assistance their own circumstances permitted, from sharing information about potential work opportunities to providing small gifts of food or household items that could ease her immediate burdens. Others maintained polite distance, that reflected either disapproval of her situation or fear that too much association might create expectations for support they couldn't afford to provide. The church, that had been central to her social life during happier times, remained welcoming, but Eleanor found herself increasingly uncomfortable with charity that emphasized her dependence rather than recognizing her efforts toward self-sufficiency. Well-meaning parishioners would approach after services with offers of help that, while genuinely kind, reminded her constantly of how far she had fallen from her previous status as a respected community member whose contributions were valued, rather than someone whose needs created obligations for others. Sunday services provided temporary respite from the grinding worry that characterized her daily existence, but even spiritual comfort was complicated by practical concerns about appropriate clothing, acceptable offerings for the collection plate, and the social expectations that surrounded church attendance. Eleanor's pride, which had sustained her through the worst moments of grief and financial crisis, sometimes conflicted with her genuine need for the community support that religious fellowship provided. Her correspondence with her brother Patrick in Pittsburgh had become less frequent as months passed, without improvement in her situation. Partly because she was reluctant to burden him with problems he couldn't solve from such a distance, but also because his letters revealed his own struggles with industrial employment that offered better wages than mining, but created different forms of insecurity. Patrick's descriptions of city life emphasized opportunities that might be available to someone with her skills, but also highlighted the cultural adjustments that would be required for someone whose entire life had been shaped by rural mountain existence. Samuel's vision for their future together had extended far beyond the typical expectations of mining families who accepted the dangerous underground work as their permanent destiny. He had shared with Eleanor his dreams of accumulating enough capital to purchase land that could provide economic security through diversified farming, timber operations, and possibly small-scale manufacturing that would take advantage of the region's water power and natural resources. His plans had included detailed calculations about land acquisition costs, construction expenses for various buildings, and projected income from different agricultural and forestry activities that demonstrated both practical knowledge and careful financial planning. Their wedding in the spring of 1909 had been celebrated as a union that brought together two of the community's most respected families, while representing the kind of ambition and planning that could help individuals transcend the limitations that had historically confined mountain residents to single-generation economic cycles. The ceremony had taken place in the small Catholic church that served the Irish community, followed by a reception at the community hall where neighbors from various ethnic backgrounds had gathered to wish the couple well and to enjoy the music and dancing that had continued until nearly dawn. The first years of their marriage had been marked by steady progress toward the goals Samuel had outlined during their courtship. His promotion to mine foreman had provided increased income that they had saved carefully rather than spending on immediate comforts, while Eleanor's domestic skills had enabled them to maintain a comfortable household on modest expenditures that maximized their ability to accumulate capital for land purchases. Their small rental house had become a model of efficient organization where everything served dual purposes, and waste was minimized through careful planning and creative adaptation of available resources. The purchase of the original Hawthorne homestead in 1912 had represented the culmination of 4 years of careful saving and strategic planning. The property, which had been owned by an elderly widow whose children had moved to distant cities, included the main house, several outbuildings, and 40 acres of mixed farmland and timber that provided immediate opportunities for income generation while offering potential for future expansion. Samuel's knowledge of construction techniques had enabled him to make necessary repairs and improvements without hiring outside labor, while Eleanor's gardening experience had helped establish productive vegetable gardens and flower beds that enhanced both their food security and their property's aesthetic appeal. The expansion of their land holdings during the prosperous years between 1912 and 1920 had reflected Samuel's careful analysis of regional economic trends and his recognition that diversification would provide security against the inevitable downturns that affected single-industry communities. Each additional purchase had been planned to complement their existing operations, whether through improved access to water resources, better timber stands, or more suitable agricultural land that could support expanded livestock operations. The gradual accumulation of nearly 400 acres had positioned them among the most substantial landowners in the valley, with assets that appeared to guarantee long-term security for their family. Eleanor's role in building their economic success had extended far beyond traditional domestic responsibilities to include active participation in business decisions and direct involvement in income-generating activities that required her knowledge and skills. Her ability to manage complex household budgets had enabled them to maximize savings during good years, while her talents for food preservation and textile production had reduced their dependence on purchased goods that could strain their finances during leaner periods. Most importantly, her partnership in planning and decision-making had provided Samuel with intellectual companionship that enhanced his own business judgment while ensuring that their goals reflected both their individual priorities and their shared vision for their future. The tragedy that had begun to unfold during 1920 had been initially invisible, manifesting only through Samuel's gradually increasing fatigue and occasional coughing that they had attributed to normal effects of years spent working in dusty underground conditions. The slow progression of silicosis had been difficult to detect amid the general exhaustion that characterized mining work, while Samuel's stoical nature had prevented him from complaining about symptoms that he had assumed were simply part of the price paid for underground employment. By the time medical examination had revealed the extent of lung damage, the disease had progressed beyond any possibility of cure or significant improvement. The final 2 years of Samuel's life had been marked by his gradual transition from active partner in their various enterprises to increasingly dependent invalid, who required constant care while watching helplessly as his dreams of expanded prosperity dissolved into medical expenses and lost productivity. Eleanor had struggled to maintain their various business operations while providing the nursing care that Samuel's condition required, gradually falling behind in maintenance tasks and income-generating activities that had previously been shared responsibilities. The emotional strain of watching her husband's slow decline had been compounded by growing awareness that his death would leave her with obligations and challenges that exceeded her individual capabilities. The community support that had sustained them during Samuel's final illness had been generous, but limited by the economic difficulties that were affecting everyone in the region, as mining operations reduced their workforce and supporting businesses struggled to maintain profitability. Neighbors had provided what assistance they could through shared labor, donated food, and emotional support that had helped Eleanor cope with the immediate crisis. But the long-term financial implications of Samuel's death had been beyond what community resources could address. The medical bills that had accumulated during his final months had consumed most of their savings, while the loss of his income had made it impossible to continue the debt payments that had been manageable when both partners were contributing to their household economy. The 18 months that had passed since Samuel's death had been characterized by Eleanor's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain economic stability through individual effort that had proven inadequate to address the scale of their accumulated obligations. Each small success in generating income had been offset by unexpected expenses or reduced demand for her services, while the property that had once represented security had become a burden that consumed resources faster than her efforts could replenish them. The approaching foreclosure represented not only the loss of her home, but also the final failure of dreams that had once seemed achievable through hard work and careful planning. As Eleanor sat in her kitchen on that December morning, surrounded by the legal documents that would soon transfer ownership of everything she had worked to preserve, she found herself reflecting on the irony that the very qualities that had made her successful as Samuel's partner, her attention to detail, her careful planning, her refusal to accept defeat, had perhaps prolonged her suffering by preventing her from recognizing sooner that some situations exceeded individual solution through any reasonable means available to someone in her circumstances. Eleanor's mornings began in darkness that seemed to press against the frost-covered windows like a living thing, demanding acknowledgement of the harsh realities that daylight would soon reveal in unforgiving detail. The ritual of coaxing life from the banked coals in her kitchen stove had become a meditation on survival, each carefully placed piece of fuel representing another small victory against the cold that threatened to reclaim her home from the inside out. Her breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air as she worked, reminding her constantly of how precarious her situation had become now that purchasing adequate fuel required choosing between warmth and other necessities that were equally essential for maintaining her tenuous grip on independence. The water pitcher beside her wash basin frequently bore a thin skin of ice that had to be broken each morning before she could complete even the most basic personal hygiene tasks. The pipes that brought water from the spring had frozen solid twice during the past month, requiring her to haul buckets from the creek when the indoor plumbing failed completely. These failures of infrastructure that Samuel had maintained effortlessly highlighted the countless ways that her solitary existence depended on systems and knowledge that she was still struggling to master under circumstances that offered little margin for error or learning through gradual experience. Her attempts to maintain the livestock that Samuel had accumulated during their years of prosperity had revealed both her determination and the practical limitations that threatened to make continued animal husbandry impossible despite her growing emotional attachment to creatures whose welfare depended entirely on her consistency and competence. The 4 dairy cows that remained from their original herd required attention twice daily, regardless of weather conditions or her physical state, demanding that she venture outside during blizzards and ice storms that made even short journeys between buildings potentially dangerous for someone working without assistance or backup support. Milking the cows had proven particularly challenging for hands that lacked the strength and calluses that Samuel had developed through years of practice, resulting in sessions that took twice as long as necessary while producing quantities of milk that barely justified the effort required to obtain them. The complicated process of separating cream, churning butter, and preparing cheese had become exercises in improvisation, as Eleanor attempted to recreate techniques that she had observed but never performed independently during the years when Samuel had managed most interactions with their livestock. The chickens that scratched through the snow around her barnyard had adapted better to her inexperienced management, perhaps because their needs aligned more closely with her domestic skills and patient temperament. She had discovered unexpected satisfaction in observing their individual personalities and behaviors, learning to predict which hens would produce eggs reliably and which required special attention during cold weather to maintain their productivity. The small income generated by selling surplus eggs provided psychological benefits that exceeded its modest financial contribution, representing proof that she could successfully manage at least some aspects of agricultural production without male guidance or supervision. Her kitchen garden, dormant beneath its protective covering of mulch and snow, represented both past achievement and future possibility that sustained her hope during the darkest moments of winter isolation. The vegetables and herbs that filled her root cellar had been grown through her own labor and knowledge, providing tangible evidence that she possessed skills capable of supporting independent survival under favorable conditions. The seed packets stored in her pantry awaited spring planting that might never occur if foreclosure proceedings eliminated her access to the land where she had learned to coax abundance from soil that rewarded careful attention and patient cultivation. The sewing work that provided her primary source of cash income had evolved from pleasant hobby to essential survival skill that occupied most of her evening hours after completing the farm chores that could not be postponed or delegated to others. Her reputation for excellent craftsmanship had spread throughout the valley, despite the economic decline that had reduced demand for non-essential goods and services, creating steady demand for her abilities among families who had learned to value quality workmanship during times when replacement costs made durability more important than initial price considerations. Working by lamplight that cast dancing shadows across fabric and thread, Eleanor had developed techniques for maximizing efficiency while maintaining the attention to detail that distinguished her work from the hasty alterations offered by less skilled competitors. Her specialty in children's clothing had proven particularly valuable during economic hard times, when parents sought garments that could withstand active use, while providing room for growth that would extend their useful life beyond single seasons. The mothers who brought her their sewing projects often lingered for conversation that provided welcome social contact, while revealing information about community conditions that affected her own planning and decision-making. These evening visitors had become Eleanor's primary source of news about regional developments that might influence her situation, from changes in local employment opportunities to shifts in political attitudes that could affect foreclosure proceedings or social support. For individuals facing similar economic difficulties, the informal network of women who gathered around her kitchen table while waiting for alterations to be completed had created a support system that provided emotional sustenance even when practical assistance remained beyond their collective capabilities. Mrs. Henderson, whose German immigrant family had established a successful farm despite facing initial hostility from established residents, had become Eleanor's most reliable source of practical advice about managing agricultural operations without male assistance. Her visits often included gifts of preserved foods or household items that she presented as payment for sewing services, allowing Eleanor to accept help without compromising the pride that had sustained her through months of increasing dependence on community charity. The friendship that had developed between the two women had provided Eleanor with someone who understood the challenges of adapting traditional female roles to circumstances that required unprecedented independence and self-reliance. Young Sarah Mitchell, whose husband worked in the remaining active mine shaft 15 miles away, brought news about employment opportunities and labor conditions that might affect the region's economic recovery prospects. Her cheerful disposition and optimistic outlook provided counterbalance to Eleanor's growing pessimism about the possibility of individual solutions to problems that seemed to require broader economic improvement beyond any single person's control. The friendship also offered glimpses of how other young wives were adapting to uncertainty and hardship that characterized life throughout Appalachian mining communities during the difficult early 1920s. The weekly trips to town that had once provided pleasant breaks from rural routine had evolved into carefully planned expeditions that required strategic thinking about timing, weather conditions, and the complex social dynamics that governed interactions between community members. During periods of economic stress, Eleanor's walks along the winding dirt road that connected her property to Cedar Ridge's main street provided opportunities for reflection and planning, while also serving as informal surveys of regional conditions that she could observe through changes in property maintenance, business activity, and the general atmosphere of optimism or despair that characterized different neighborhoods. The general store where she purchased essential supplies and attempted to market her sewing services had become a barometer of community, economic health that revealed disturbing trends toward reduced inventory, delayed restocking, and increased reliance on barter arrangements that indicated cash shortages among both merchants and customers. Mr. Peterson, the elderly proprietor, who had operated the business for nearly 30 years, had begun accepting eggs, vegetables, and handmade goods in exchange for manufactured items that his suppliers increasingly demanded payment for in advance, rather than extending the credit terms that had previously characterized rural business relationships. These changes in commercial practices reflected broader shifts in regional economic relationships that were eliminating the informal credit systems and reciprocal obligations that had enabled mountain communities to survive previous periods of hardship through mutual assistance and delayed settlement of accounts. The transition toward cash-only transactions had created particular difficulties for individuals like Eleanor, whose income remained irregular and unpredictable, despite their willingness to work and their proven reliability in meeting obligations when circumstances permitted. The post office where Eleanor collected her infrequent mail had become another source of information about community conditions through conversations with postal workers who possessed comprehensive knowledge about which families were receiving money from relatives in distant cities, which businesses were reducing their correspondence due to declining activity, and which residents had ceased maintaining their postal addresses due to departure or foreclosure. These observations, while sometimes painful to contemplate, provided Eleanor with context for understanding that her situation was part of broader regional decline rather than individual failure or inadequate effort on her part. Her correspondence with Brother Patrick in Pittsburgh had gradually decreased in frequency as months passed, without significant improvement in either of their situations, creating emotional distance that compounded her physical isolation from family support systems. Patrick's letters, when they arrived, described industrial employment that offered higher wages than mining, but created different forms of insecurity through layoffs, strikes, and working conditions that threatened health and safety through mechanisms different from, but equally dangerous as, the underground hazards that had claimed Samuel's life. The church that had provided spiritual comfort and social connection throughout Eleanor's life had maintained its welcoming attitude toward her continued participation despite her obvious financial difficulties. But the subtle changes in how other parishioners interacted with her had created awkwardness that made attendance emotionally complicated. Well-meaning offers of assistance often emphasized her neediness, rather than acknowledging her continuing contributions to community welfare through her various skills and efforts, while conversations that had once focused on mutual interests now frequently centered on expressions of sympathy that reminded her constantly of her changed circumstances. The seasonal rhythms that had once provided structure and meaning to rural life had been disrupted by the constant pressure of financial crisis that made it difficult to plan beyond immediate survival needs or to invest time and energy in activities that might not produce immediate practical benefits. Eleanor found herself unable to enjoy the simple pleasures of watching weather patterns, observing wildlife, or appreciating the natural beauty that had previously provided spiritual nourishment during difficult periods. Even reading, which had been her primary source of entertainment and intellectual stimulation during long winter evenings, had become complicated by concerns about the cost of lamp oil and the need to prioritize income-generating activities over personal enjoyment. The physical demands of maintaining her property through winter weather had revealed reserves of strength and endurance that Eleanor hadn't known she possessed, while also highlighting the accumulating wear and tear on systems that required knowledge and resources beyond her current capabilities to address effectively. The roof repairs that Samuel would have completed quickly and permanently had become ongoing challenges that required constant attention and improvised solutions that provided only temporary relief from problems that would ultimately require professional intervention she couldn't afford. Her sleep, when exhaustion finally overcame anxiety enough to permit rest, was frequently interrupted by sounds that required investigation to determine whether they represented normal settling of an old house or potential emergencies that demanded immediate action. The responsibility of serving as sole guardian for property and livestock had created hypervigilance that prevented the deep rest necessary for physical and emotional recovery from the daily stresses that characterized her existence. As December progressed toward the January deadline that would determine her future, Eleanor found herself caught between stubborn determination to preserve everything Samuel had worked to achieve and growing recognition that her individual efforts might be insufficient to overcome obstacles that required resources and assistance beyond what seemed likely to become available through any realistic means. The first harbinger of approaching catastrophe had arrived 3 days before Christmas in the form of a telegram delivered by young Tommy Briggs, whose bicycle wheels left dark tracks through the fresh snow that had begun falling during the early morning hours. Eleanor had been in the barn tending to the cattle when she heard the boy's voice calling her name across the yard, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air as he struggled to balance his bicycle against the increasingly treacherous conditions that were making travel dangerous even for experienced riders, familiar with every curve and pothole along the mountain roads. The yellow Western Union envelope had trembled in her cold, numbed fingers as she read the terse message from Harrison Whitfield at the Farmers and Merchants Bank, informing her that the board of directors had voted to accelerate the foreclosure timeline due to new federal banking regulations that required immediate resolution of non-performing loans. Instead of the 30 days she'd been counting on to explore final alternatives or possibly negotiate extended payment arrangements, Eleanor now faced a deadline of January 15th, reducing her remaining time to just 3 weeks during the worst weather conditions of an already brutal winter. The economic pressures that had been building throughout the region like storm clouds gathering over distant peaks had finally reached the breaking point that would transform individual hardships into community-wide disaster. Word had spread through Cedar Ridge's informal communication networks that Consolidated Coal Company planned to cease all operations by spring, eliminating the last significant source of employment that had sustained families throughout the valley for more than 4 decades. The announcement had triggered panic selling among property owners who recognized that real estate values would collapse completely once the mining infrastructure was dismantled and the population dispersed to seek opportunities elsewhere. Eleanor's neighbor, Jacob Müller, had stopped by her kitchen door on the morning after the telegram's arrival to share the devastating news that his own farm was being offered for sale at less than half what he had paid for it just 5 years earlier. Yet even at those reduced prices, potential buyers remained scarce in a market where everyone understood that economic recovery seemed impossible given the fundamental changes reshaping the region's industrial base. His weathered face had reflected the same mixture of desperation and bewilderment that Eleanor recognized in her own mirror each morning. The expression of people who had played by established rules, only to discover that the game itself had changed. Beyond recognition, the Henderson family, whose friendship had provided Eleanor with both practical support and emotional encouragement throughout her months of struggle, had made the painful decision to abandon their homestead and relocate to relatives in Ohio, rather than continue fighting circumstances that exceeded their ability to overcome through individual effort alone. Mrs. Henderson's tearful farewell visit had included the gift of preserved foods from her pantry and several pieces of household equipment that would be too expensive to transport, but also the sobering admission that their departure represented surrender to forces that neither hard work nor good intentions could successfully resist. These departures had created a cascade effect throughout the community as remaining residents found themselves increasingly isolated from the social and economic networks that had previously provided mutual support during difficult periods. The general store had reduced its operating hours due to declining customer traffic, while the blacksmith had announced his intention to seek employment in the county seat, where demand for his services might sustain a modest income. Even the church had begun discussing consolidation with congregations in neighboring valleys, acknowledging that their membership could no longer support full-time pastoral care or maintain the building that had served as the community's spiritual center for more than 30 years. The weather itself seemed to conspire against any possibility of reversing the deteriorating situation, as temperatures had remained below freezing for 2 consecutive weeks, while snow accumulations reached levels that made travel between homesteads difficult and sometimes impossible. Eleanor's attempts to reach town for essential supplies had been frustrated by conditions that made the 2-mile walk treacherous, even for someone familiar with every stone and rut along the route, while the increased physical demands of maintaining adequate heat and managing livestock during extreme cold had left her exhausted and increasingly vulnerable to the respiratory ailments that flourished during harsh winter months. The coal shortage that was affecting households throughout the region had forced Eleanor to supplement her dwindling fuel supply with wood from her own timber stands, requiring her to fell trees and split logs, despite having no previous experience with the dangerous work that Samuel had always handled personally. Her amateur efforts with axe and saw had produced adequate quantities of fuel, but also several minor injuries that highlighted her vulnerability to accidents that could prove catastrophic for someone living alone without immediate access to medical care or emergency assistance. The livestock that represented both economic assets and daily responsibilities had begun showing signs of stress from inadequate nutrition as hay supplies dwindled and the cost of purchasing additional feed exceeded Eleanor's modest income from sowing and occasional egg sales. The dairy cows that had once provided reliable income were now consuming resources faster than they could generate revenue. Yet selling them seemed equally problematic, given that market demand had collapsed along with the regional population that had previously supported local agricultural production. Her chickens, while requiring less expensive care than larger animals, had reduced their egg production in response to cold stress and irregular feeding schedules that reflected Eleanor's inexperience with poultry management during extreme weather conditions. The birds that had seemed hardy and adaptable during milder months now huddled together in their inadequately insulated coop, creating concerns about disease transmission that could eliminate her small flock entirely if proper preventive measures weren't implemented immediately. The root cellar that had seemed abundantly stocked with preserved vegetables during autumn's harvest season was now revealing the inadequacies of Eleanor's food storage techniques, as various items showed signs of spoilage that threatened to reduce her food security during the months when nothing fresh could be obtained from gardens or local sources. Her inexperience with the precise temperature and humidity control required for long-term food preservation had resulted in losses that she could ill afford during a period when purchasing replacement supplies strained her already inadequate budget. The sewing work that provided her primary income had become increasingly difficult to complete during evening hours when poor lighting strained her eyes and cold temperatures made fine needlework nearly impossible, despite wearing gloves that interfered with the manual dexterity required for quality craftsmanship. Several customers had complained about delayed completion of projects that Eleanor had been forced to postpone when weather conditions made detailed work too challenging to maintain her usual standards of excellence. The isolation that had gradually increased throughout the autumn months had intensified dramatically, as winter weather eliminated casual visits and social interactions that had previously provided emotional support and practical assistance during challenging periods. Eleanor's conversations were now limited primarily to brief exchanges with delivery personnel and the occasional neighbor who braved dangerous traveling conditions to check on her welfare, creating loneliness that compounded the stress of managing practical survival challenges without adequate resources or experience. The letters from her brother Patrick in Pittsburgh had become increasingly infrequent as his own employment situation deteriorated, along with industrial conditions that were eliminating jobs throughout the steel manufacturing sector. His most recent communication had mentioned temporary layoffs and reduced wages that made it impossible for him to provide financial assistance, even if Eleanor had been willing to compromise her pride by requesting help from family members who were facing their own economic difficulties. The legal complexities surrounding her foreclosure had become more daunting as Eleanor attempted to understand procedures and requirements that seemed designed to favor creditors while providing minimal protection for property owners facing circumstances beyond their reasonable control. The single attorney in Cedar Ridge had been sympathetic but honest about the limited options available to someone without sufficient resources to pursue lengthy legal challenges that might delay but ultimately could not prevent the loss of property. When debts exceeded realistic repayment capabilities, the town's bank president, Harrison Whitfield, had expressed genuine regret about the necessity of proceeding with foreclosure action against someone whose family had been valued community members for decades, but had also explained that federal banking examiners were demanding immediate resolution of questionable loans, regardless of local relationships or individual circumstances that might justify extended forbearance under normal conditions. The institutional pressures that were driving his decisions reflected broader changes in financial regulations that prioritized systematic risk reduction over community stability or individual hardship considerations. The newspaper reports that occasionally reached Cedar Ridge described similar economic collapses occurring throughout rural America as agricultural prices declined, industrial employment contracted, and small communities lost the economic foundations that had sustained them since the previous century's expansion into previously undeveloped regions. Eleanor's situation, while personally devastating, represented part of a broader transformation that was reshaping American society in ways that would have long-term consequences extending far beyond individual hardships or regional difficulties. The approaching Christmas holiday had lost all meaning beyond marking another milestone toward the January deadline that would determine her future, while the traditional celebrations that had previously provided spiritual comfort and community connection seemed inappropriate given the suffering that characterized most families throughout the valley. Even the church services that Eleanor continued attending, despite her emotional struggles, reflected the somber mood of a congregation whose members were increasingly preoccupied with survival concerns that left little energy for seasonal joy or religious observance. The dreams that had sustained Eleanor through the initial months following Samuel's death had gradually faded as practical realities eliminated possibilities that had once seemed achievable through determination and hard work alone. The vision of maintaining their property while building economic independence through diversified agricultural and domestic production now appeared impossibly naive, given the systematic collapse of local markets and support systems that had made such goals realistic during more stable periods. As January approached with the inexorable certainty of winter weather and legal deadlines, Eleanor found herself facing choices that would determine not only her immediate survival, but also her long-term identity as either someone who had successfully adapted to unprecedented challenges, or someone whose dreams had been destroyed by circumstances beyond any individual's ability to control or overcome through reasonable effort. The morning of January 8th dawned with a crystalline clarity that seemed to mock Eleanor's desperate circumstances as brilliant sunlight transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling display that hurt her eyes while illuminating every detail of the property she would soon lose forever. The foreclosure notice that had arrived the previous afternoon lay spread across her kitchen table like an accusation, its legal language describing in clinical terms the process that would strip away everything Samuel had worked to build during their 15 years of marriage. 7 days remained before the final deadline, and Eleanor had exhausted every conventional option for raising the money that might have saved her home. The decision to clean the chimney had been born of desperate practicality rather than any hope of discovering hidden treasures, as the coal stove that provided her primary source of heat had been drawing poorly for several weeks, creating dangerous conditions that threatened to fill her house with deadly carbon monoxide during the bitter cold nights that still lay ahead. Eleanor had postponed the maintenance task throughout December due to her inexperience with such work and the physical demands it would require. But the approaching loss of her property had eliminated concerns about preserving her dignity through avoiding tasks that Samuel had always handled personally. The ladder that she dragged from the barn to the side of her house had belonged to Samuel's father, its wooden rungs worn smooth by generations of Hawthorne men who had used it for maintenance projects that kept their property in excellent condition. Despite the harsh weather conditions that tested every building's structural integrity, Eleanor's hands shook as she positioned the ladder against the stone chimney that rose from the kitchen hearth, partly from cold, but mostly from fear of the dangerous work she was about to attempt without assistance or backup support if something went wrong. Climbing to the roof level required courage that Eleanor had to summon from reserves she hadn't known existed, as the combination of icy conditions and her inexperience with ladder work created risks that a more prudent person might have avoided until professional help became available. The view from the rooftop revealed the full extent of her property's winter beauty, from the snow-laden branches of the apple orchard Samuel had planted during their early married years to the pristine meadows that would soon belong to whoever purchased the land at the foreclosure auction. More troubling was the realization that her remaining time before the foreclosure deadline provided only 6 days to locate and recover sufficient treasure to satisfy her debts, assuming that Morrison's caches actually existed and contained the valuable items described in his carefully preserved records. The race against time would test every aspect of Eleanor's determination, resourcefulness, and physical endurance, while requiring her to risk everything on the possibility that a notorious outlaw's hidden treasure could provide the salvation that no other source seemed capable of offering. Eleanor's hands trembled as she spread Morrison's map across her kitchen table, weighing down the corners with heavy ceramic bowls to prevent the aged paper from curling, while she studied the intricate details that might represent her salvation or merely elaborate fiction created by a desperate criminal's imagination. The morning light, streaming through her frost-covered windows, illuminated hand-drawn symbols and measurements that had been executed with the precision of someone accustomed to creating documents that lives might depend upon. Yet the fantastic nature of the claims made in the accompanying letters created doubt about whether any reasonable person should risk precious time pursuing what might prove to be an elaborate hoax. The first location marked on Morrison's map corresponded to a distinctive rock formation known locally as Eagle's Perch, situated approximately half a mile upstream from Eleanor's property along Copper Creek, where the water carved a sharp bend around granite outcroppings that had resisted erosion for countless centuries. The detailed instructions indicated that the treasure cache was buried 30 paces due north from the largest boulder, at a depth of 4 feet beneath a flat stone that had been carefully positioned to appear natural while marking the precise location of buried wealth. That Morrison claimed would be sufficient to purchase a substantial farm. Eleanor's decision to investigate the Eagle's Perch location first reflected both its proximity to her home and the practical consideration that failure to find anything there would allow her to abandon the treasure hunting venture without investing excessive time in what might prove to be futile effort. The winter clothing that she assembled for the expedition included Samuel's heavy wool coat, which provided better protection against cold wind than her own lighter garments, along with his leather boots that offered superior traction on icy ground despite being slightly too large for her smaller feet. The tools that Eleanor gathered for excavation work included a sturdy shovel from the barn, a pickaxe for breaking through frozen ground, and a coal scuttle that could serve as a container for transporting any items she might discover during her investigation. The rope that she coiled around her shoulders had been Samuel's climbing equipment during his younger years, potentially useful for navigation across difficult terrain or extraction of heavy objects that individual strength alone couldn't manage. Effectively, the journey to Eagle's Perch required careful navigation across snow-covered ground, where familiar landmarks had been transformed by winter weather into configurations that challenged even Eleanor's intimate knowledge of every hill, stream, and trail throughout the valley. The creek itself had frozen solid except for narrow channels where moving water prevented complete ice formation, creating treacherous conditions that required constant attention to prevent accidents that could prove catastrophic for someone traveling alone without backup support or emergency communication capabilities. The rock formation that served as her destination had been familiar to Eleanor since childhood, when family picnics and community gatherings had occasionally included expeditions to scenic locations that provided relief from the industrial atmosphere that characterized most of Cedar Ridge during its mining boom years. The granite boulders that comprised Eagle's Perch rose nearly 20 feet above the surrounding landscape, creating natural platforms where visitors could enjoy panoramic views of the valley while children explored crevices and caves that made the location popular for adventurous play. Morrison's instructions proved remarkably accurate in their description of specific landmarks and measurements that Eleanor could verify through direct observation, lending credibility to claims that had seemed almost too fantastic to believe when she had first read them in the warmth and security of her kitchen. The largest boulder that served as the starting point for measurements was unmistakable, while the compass bearings and pace counts provided clear guidance for locating the spot where Morrison claimed to have buried wealth that represented years of successful criminal activity. The ground where Eleanor began digging had been frozen to a depth that required sustained effort with the pickaxe before the shovel could make meaningful progress toward the 4-foot depth that Morrison's instructions specified as necessary to reach the buried container. The physical demands of excavation work in winter conditions tested Eleanor's endurance while creating perspiration that quickly chilled in the frigid air, requiring frequent breaks to prevent exhaustion that could leave her vulnerable to hypothermia. or other cold-related injuries. 3 feet below the surface, Eleanor's shovel struck something solid that created a metallic sound distinctly different from the dull impact of steel against stone or frozen earth. The excitement that surged through her at this first concrete evidence that Morrison's map might be accurate was immediately tempered by the practical challenge of extracting what appeared to be a substantial metal container from the narrow excavation she had created through hours of difficult labor. The object that gradually emerged through careful digging proved to be a cast-iron strongbox, approximately 18 inches square and 8 inches deep, secured with a heavy lock that showed signs of age, but appeared to be in working condition, despite decades of burial, in conditions that would have destroyed most metal objects. The weight of the container, as Eleanor struggled to lift it from the excavation, suggested contents that were either very dense or present in sufficient quantities to represent significant value. The decision to transport the strongbox back to her house before attempting to open it reflected Eleanor's awareness that extended exposure to winter weather while examining potentially valuable contents could create risks that outweighed any advantages of immediate investigation. The journey home with the heavy container proved even more challenging than the initial expedition, as the additional weight affected her balance on icy surfaces, while the awkward shape made it difficult to maintain secure grip during the careful navigation required to avoid accidents. Back in her kitchen, Eleanor examined the strongbox more carefully, noting construction details that suggested quality craftsmanship and materials chosen for durability rather than economy. The lock mechanism appeared to be a relatively simple design that might yield to careful manipulation with appropriate tools, though Morrison's papers included a separate note indicating that the key had been hidden separately as additional security against unauthorized access by casual discoverers. The lockpicking attempt that Eleanor undertook using household implements and techniques improvised from general mechanical principles proved surprisingly successful, possibly because the mechanism had been designed for security against casual interference rather than determined effort by someone with legitimate claim to the contents. The satisfying click that accompanied the lock's release created anticipation that was almost unbearable as Eleanor prepared to discover whether Morrison's claims about buried treasure contained any foundation in reality. The strongbox's contents exceeded even Eleanor's most optimistic expectations, revealing layers of carefully wrapped packages that contained gold coins in denominations she had never seen outside of banks, along with silver bars bearing stamps that indicated their origin from mining operations throughout the Western Territories. The total quantity of precious metals appeared sufficient to satisfy her debt obligations, while providing substantial reserves for future security, assuming that the materials were genuine rather than clever counterfeits designed to deceive potential discoverers. The accompanying documentation that Morrison had included with the treasure provided authenticity information and approximate values that suggested the strongbox contents were worth significantly more than the $3,000 Eleanor needed to prevent foreclosure, while additional notations indicated that this cachet represented only a fraction of the total wealth Morrison had hidden throughout the region. The possibility that other locations might yield similar discoveries created excitement about opportunities for long-term financial security that extended far beyond merely preventing immediate disaster. However, Eleanor's elation at discovering genuine treasure was tempered by practical concerns about converting precious metals into usable currency without attracting attention that might create legal complications or safety risks. The coins and silver bars would need to be authenticated and sold through channels that could provide fair value while maintaining discretion about their source and the circumstances of their discovery. The time constraints that still governed Eleanor's situation meant that she had less than 5 days to liquidate sufficient treasure to meet the foreclosure deadline, requiring rapid action that might compromise her ability to negotiate optimal prices for materials that deserved careful evaluation by qualified experts. The nearest banks and precious metals dealers were located in larger towns that required travel through winter conditions that could prove dangerous for someone carrying valuable cargo without security protection. More immediately challenging was the question of whether to continue searching for additional caches that Morrison's map indicated were located throughout the valley, potentially providing enough wealth to transform Eleanor's circumstances completely while eliminating any future concerns about economic security. The physical demands of treasure hunting during winter weather had to be balanced against the potential rewards, and the limited time available before legal proceedings would eliminate her access to properties where other treasures might be buried. The discovery that had begun as a desperate attempt to solve an immediate crisis had evolved into an opportunity that could reshape Eleanor's entire future. Assuming that she could successfully navigate the practical challenges of converting hidden treasure into usable assets, while avoiding complications that might attract unwanted attention from authorities or criminal elements who might be interested in claiming Morrison's legacy for themselves. The evening light that filtered through her kitchen windows as Eleanor carefully rewrapped the precious metals for secure storage reminded her that each passing hour brought the foreclosure deadline closer, while also providing time for other treasure hunters to learn about Morrison's map if word of her discovery somehow leaked into community gossip networks. The balance between caution and urgency would determine whether her incredible luck in finding the Chimney cache would translate into actual salvation or merely temporary excitement before ultimate failure to preserve the property that represented everything Samuel had worked to achieve. The strongbox that now sat securely hidden in her bedroom closet represented both solution to her immediate problems and the beginning of adventures that would test every aspect of her courage, judgment, and determination to succeed despite obstacles that had previously seemed insurmountable through any reasonable means available to someone in her circumstances. The bitter wind that howled across the valley on the morning of January 10th carried more than just the promise of another harsh winter storm, as Eleanor discovered when she observed 3 horsemen approaching her property from the direction of town, their dark silhouettes moving with the purposeful determination of men who had traveled through dangerous weather conditions to accomplish specific business that could not be postponed despite the obvious risks involved. The riders' appearance at such an early hour and under such challenging conditions immediately aroused Eleanor's suspicions about their intentions, particularly given that legitimate visitors typically announced their planned arrival through normal social channels rather than appearing unexpectedly during the worst weather of an already brutal winter season. Eleanor's first instinct was to conceal any evidence of her recent treasure hunting activities, quickly gathering Morrison's maps and documents from her kitchen table and securing them in the bedroom closet alongside the strongbox that contained the gold coins and silver bars she had recovered from the Eagle's Perch cache. The precaution proved wise when the leading rider dismounted at her front porch and knocked on her door with the aggressive authority of someone accustomed to having his demands met without question or delay, his bearing suggesting either law enforcement background or the kind of criminal experience that created similar patterns of intimidating behavior. The man who introduced himself as Deputy Marshal William Crawford presented credentials that appeared authentic, though Eleanor's limited experience with federal law enforcement made it difficult for her to verify their legitimacy through visual inspection alone. Crawford's companions remained mounted and alert, their hands positioned near weapons in ways that suggested they expected potential trouble, despite approaching the home of a widowed woman who posed no obvious threat to experienced lawmen. The deputies' explanation for their visit focused on reports of suspicious activity in the area that might be connected to ongoing investigations into historical criminal cases that had recently been reopened due to new evidence. Crawford's questions initially seemed routine, inquiring about whether Eleanor had observed strangers in the vicinity or noticed any unusual activities that might indicate treasure hunting or archaeological excavation by unauthorized persons seeking to locate items of historical or monetary value. However, his queries gradually became more specific, revealing knowledge about Jacob Morrison's criminal activities and the persistent rumors about hidden treasure that had attracted intermittent attention from various law enforcement agencies. Throughout the decades since the outlaw's disappearance from the region, the deputy's mention of Morrison's name created immediate anxiety for Eleanor, who struggled to maintain composure while wondering whether her discovery of the treasure map had somehow become known to authorities through sources she couldn't identify. The possibility that her chimney cleaning activities had been observed by neighbors, or that her excavation work at Eagle's Perch had left evidence visible to experienced investigators, created fears about legal complications that could destroy her hopes of using the treasure to prevent foreclosure. Crawford's demeanor shifted noticeably when Eleanor claimed complete ignorance about Morrison's activities or any treasure hunting in the area, his skeptical expression suggesting either professional suspicion about her truthfulness or specific information that contradicted her denials. The deputy's request to search her property for evidence of excavation or concealed items represented a direct threat to Eleanor's plans, though she recognized that refusing permission might create even greater suspicion about activities she was desperately trying to keep secret. The systematic search that Crawford and his companions conducted throughout Eleanor's house and outbuildings revealed their experience with such investigations, as they examined locations and employed techniques that suggested familiarity with criminal hiding places and treasure concealment methods. Their attention to details like disturbed earth, unusual tool marks, or modifications to building structures indicated knowledge about Morrison's methods that had been acquired through previous investigations or intelligence sources within criminal networks. The community that had once seemed destined for abandonment was now thriving under Eleanor's leadership and investment, while her own life had evolved from isolation and desperation to purpose and fulfillment that validated every risk she had taken during those terrifying days when survival had depended on courage she hadn't known she possessed. The mare that grazed peacefully in her expanded pastures served as a daily reminder of the partnership that had enabled her escape from criminals who had underestimated the determination of a widow who refused to surrender everything her husband had worked to achieve. If you found Eleanor's incredible journey from the brink of losing everything to discovering hidden treasure as compelling as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary fortunes when they needed them most. Share this tale with someone who believes that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the most unexpected blessings, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Tomorrow we have another incredible story of hidden wealth and unlikely heroes that will remind you that fortune truly does favor the brave. Don't forget to like this video if Eleanor's courage and determination inspired you, and check out our playlist of similar treasure hunting adventures that prove truth is often stranger than fiction.